In the shadowed halls of Renaissance Florence, where power shifted like smoke through marble corridors, Niccolò Machiavelli observed a fundamental truth that would echo through centuries. The greatest enemy of any man is not the army at his gates, but the weakness that dwells within his own mind. This weakness manifests itself most clearly in the scattering of focus, the dilution of purpose, and the surrender of mental sovereignty to external forces that seek to consume and control. The modern world has become a battlefield for human attention, where invisible armies wage war against the fortress of the mind. Every notification, every distraction, every trivial demand upon our consciousness represents an assault upon the very source of our power. Yet most men surrender this power willingly, trading their focus for fleeting pleasures and meaningless stimulation, never realizing they have sold their birthright for a handful of digital coins. Focus is not merely concentration. It is the concentrated essence of human will, the laser beam of consciousness that can cut through any obstacle and reshape reality itself. When a man learns to guard his focus as jealously as a miser guards his gold, when he understands that his attention is the most precious currency he possesses, he begins the transformation from weakness to strength, from victim to victor, from the manipulated to the manipulator. The weak man allows his focus to be stolen by every passing fancy, every urgent email, every social media notification that promises connection but delivers only emptiness. He lives in a state of perpetual reaction, dancing to rhythms composed by others, his mind fragmented into 1,000 pieces, each one too small to accomplish anything of significance. Such a man is easily controlled, easily predictable, easily destroyed by those who understand the game he refuses to play. But the man who recognizes his focus as his source of power begins to see the world differently. He understands that in an age of infinite distraction, the ability to concentrate deeply on what matters most is not just an advantage, it is a superpower that separates the rulers from the ruled. This man builds walls around his attention, guards the gates of his consciousness, and ruthlessly eliminates anything that does not serve his greater purpose. The ancient Stoics spoke of the dichotomy of control, distinguishing between what lies within our power and what does not. But they understood something that modern self-help gurus often miss. The battleground for this control is the mind itself. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journals, never intended for publication, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." These words, penned by the most powerful man in the known world, reveal the deepest truth about power itself. In the corporate towers of Manhattan, a young executive named David Martinez learned this lesson through fire and blood. Rising through the ranks of a ruthless investment firm, he initially tried to succeed by working harder, staying longer, saying yes to every opportunity that crossed his desk. His calendar became a war zone of back-to-back meetings, his attention divided among dozens of projects, his mind a pinball bouncing between urgent demands and trivial requests. The result was predictable. His performance declined, his decision-making suffered, and his superiors began to question his competence. Worse, he found himself constantly outmaneuvered by colleagues who seemed to accomplish more with less effort. They attended fewer meetings but wielded more influence. They worked shorter hours but delivered better results. They appeared calm while he felt perpetually overwhelmed. The turning point came during a particularly brutal quarter, when David's scattered attention led to a costly oversight in a major deal. As he sat in his corner office at midnight, staring at the city lights below, he realized that his attempts to be everything to everyone had made him nothing to anyone. His focus had been so diluted that it had become essentially worthless. This moment of recognition marked the beginning of his transformation. David began to study not just business strategy, but the deeper principles of power and influence that great leaders throughout history had understood intuitively. He discovered that Napoleon Bonaparte, despite commanding armies across Europe, maintained such laser focus that he could dictate detailed battle plans while artillery shells exploded around him. He read about Warren Buffett's famous focus on reading and thinking, spending 80% of his time absorbing information, and only 20% on meetings and calls. Most importantly, David began to understand that his attention was not an unlimited resource to be spent carelessly, but a finite and precious asset to be invested wisely. He started treating his focus like a master chess player treats his pieces, moving them deliberately, protecting them strategically, and never sacrificing them without clear purpose and substantial gain. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it easy. David had to confront the uncomfortable truth that much of what he had been doing was not just ineffective, but actively counterproductive. He had to acknowledge that his need to appear busy and important had been undermining his actual effectiveness. Most difficult of all, he had to resist the constant pressure from colleagues and superiors to fragment his attention across multiple priorities. But as David learned to say no to the trivial and yes only to the essential, as he built systems and boundaries to protect his mental space, something remarkable began to happen. His work quality improved dramatically. Projects that once took weeks of scattered effort were completed in days of concentrated focus. His insights became sharper, his decision-making more precise, his influence more substantial. Colleagues who had once seen him as a competent but unremarkable player began to view him differently. There was something unsettling about a man who could not be distracted, who seemed immune to the chaos that consumed others, who appeared to operate by different rules entirely. In a world where everyone was struggling to keep their heads above water, David had learned to walk on the surface itself. The secret lay not in any mystical power or hidden technique, but in the simple yet profound recognition that consciousness itself is the ultimate battlefield. Every thought that enters the mind either strengthens or weakens one's position. Every moment of attention either advances one's cause or serves another's agenda. Every decision about where to direct mental energy either builds power or dissipates it. David began to see the modern workplace not as a collaboration but as a subtle form of warfare, where the weapons were not swords or guns but meetings and emails, notifications and requests, urgent deadlines and shifting priorities. Most people were unwitting casualties in this war, their attention hijacked and their focus fragmented by forces they didn't even recognize as hostile. But once you see the battlefield clearly, once you understand that your focus is both the prize being fought over and the weapon with which you fight, everything changes. You begin to recognize manipulation for what it is. You develop immunity to psychological pressure. You learn to distinguish between what appears urgent and what is actually important. Most crucially, you discover that the man who controls his own attention cannot be controlled by others. This realization led David to a deeper understanding of what Machiavelli had written about centuries earlier, that the appearance of weakness invites aggression, while the demonstration of strength creates respect and space. When a man's focus becomes unshakable, when his priorities become clear and his boundaries become firm, others naturally adjust their behavior around him. They stop making trivial requests because they know such requests will be ignored. They stop trying to manipulate him because they recognize that manipulation requires the cooperation of the manipulated. The weak man who scatters his attention is like a fortress with 100 gates, each one poorly defended, easily breached by any minor threat. The strong man who concentrates his focus is like a castle with a single, heavily fortified entrance. Difficult to assault, impossible to surprise, commanding the terrain around it through sheer presence and preparedness. As David's reputation for focused excellence grew, so did his influence within the organization. Senior partners began seeking his opinion on major decisions. Clients specifically requested his involvement in their deals. Younger associates looked to him as a model of how to operate effectively in a chaotic environment. But perhaps most importantly, David himself began to experience a sense of calm and confidence that had been absent from his life for years. This transformation illustrated a principle that extends far beyond the corporate world into every domain of human endeavor. Whether in business, relationships, creative pursuits, or personal development, the ability to maintain sustained focus on what truly matters is the distinguishing characteristic of those who achieve extraordinary results versus those who remain trapped in mediocrity. The artist who checks social media every 10 minutes will never create a masterpiece. The entrepreneur who responds to every email immediately will never build an empire. The student who studies with the television on will never develop true expertise. The athlete who trains without complete mental engagement will never reach peak performance. In each case, the division of attention ensures the division of results. Yet the opposite is equally true and far more powerful. The novelist who writes in complete isolation for 4 hours each morning will eventually produce works of lasting significance. The business owner who dedicates uninterrupted blocks of time to strategic thinking will inevitably outcompete those who remain trapped in operational details. The researcher who reads deeply rather than broadly will make discoveries that change entire fields of knowledge. This principle becomes even more crucial when we consider the nature of modern distraction. Previous generations faced external challenges to their focus: noise, interruptions, physical discomfort. Today's challenges are far more insidious because they masquerade as benefits. The smartphone promises connection but delivers isolation. Social media platforms offer community but provide performance anxiety. News feeds claim to inform but actually overwhelm and paralyze. These technologies are not neutral tools waiting to be used wisely or poorly. They are sophisticated systems designed by teams of behavioral scientists and data analysts, whose explicit goal is to capture and monetize human attention. They employ techniques derived from casino gambling, drug addiction, and psychological conditioning to create compulsive usage patterns that users experience as choice, but which are actually carefully engineered responses to precisely calibrated stimuli. Understanding this reality is essential for anyone who wishes to maintain sovereignty over their own mind. The man who believes he is in control of his technology usage while checking his phone 150 times per day is like the man who believes he is in control of his drinking while consuming a bottle of whiskey each evening. The behavior itself provides evidence that control has been lost, regardless of what the individual might believe or claim. The truly powerful man recognizes these systems for what they are and responds accordingly. He does not try to moderate his usage or find balance with forces designed to eliminate balance. Instead, he withdraws from the battlefield entirely, removing the weapons that his enemies would use against him, creating zones of complete protection around his most precious resource. This withdrawal is not retreat but strategic positioning. The general who chooses his battlefield has an enormous advantage over the general who accepts whatever terrain his enemy selects. The man who controls the environment in which his mind operates has a decisive edge over the man who allows external forces to shape his mental landscape. David learned this lesson during his second year of transformation, when he made the radical decision to eliminate social media entirely from his life. Colleagues warned him that he would miss important industry news and networking opportunities. Friends suggested he was overreacting, that moderation rather than elimination was the sensible approach. Family members worried that he was becoming antisocial and disconnected. But David had studied the data on attention. He understood that the human brain is not designed to process the constant stream of information, opinion, and emotional manipulation that social media platforms provide. He recognized that what felt like staying informed was actually a form of mental pollution that degraded his capacity for deep thought and sustained concentration. The results spoke for themselves. Within weeks of his digital detox, David noticed improvements in his ability to read complex documents without distraction, to think through problems without seeking immediate external input, and to engage in sustained conversations without the urge to check his devices. His sleep improved as his mind learned to quiet itself without the constant stimulation of digital entertainment. His relationships deepened as he became fully present rather than partially distracted during social interactions. Most importantly, David discovered that far from missing crucial information, he actually became better informed about what truly mattered. Without the noise of social media flooding his consciousness, he could focus on high-quality sources of information that provided genuine insight rather than mere sensation. He read books instead of blog posts, studied primary sources instead of commentary, and engaged with ideas deeply rather than superficially. This experience reinforced a fundamental truth about information in the modern age. More is often less, and faster is frequently slower. The man who attempts to stay current with every development in his field will understand none of them deeply. The individual who reads 100 articles per week will be less knowledgeable than the person who studies 10 carefully selected sources each month. The executive who attends every meeting will be less influential than the one who chooses his engagements strategically. Quality of attention, not quantity of information, determines the depth of understanding and the effectiveness of action. The focused man who reads 1 book per week will develop more expertise than the scattered man who skims 20 articles per day. The concentrated woman who has 3 meaningful conversations per month will build stronger relationships than the social butterfly who has 50 superficial interactions each week. This principle extends to every area of life because it reflects the fundamental nature of how the human mind processes and integrates information. We do not learn through exposure, but through engagement. We do not develop wisdom through accumulation, but through reflection. We do not build capability through activity, but through deliberate practice focused on continuous improvement. The transformation that David experienced in his professional life began to influence every other domain of his existence. He applied the same principles of focused attention to his physical health, replacing scattered workout sessions and fad diets with a consistent routine of strength training and nutrition that he followed religiously. He applied these principles to his relationships, choosing to invest deeply in a few close friendships rather than maintaining superficial connections with dozens of acquaintances. Most significantly, David began to recognize that his relationship with himself required the same focused attention that he brought to external challenges. The voice in his head that constantly criticized, worried, and second-guessed had been as much a source of distraction as any external interruption. Learning to observe these thoughts without being controlled by them, to choose which mental patterns to engage with and which to dismiss, became another frontier in his quest for complete mental sovereignty. This internal dimension of focus, the ability to direct attention not just outward toward tasks and goals, but inward toward one's own mental processes, represented the deepest level of the transformation from weakness to strength. The man who cannot control his own thoughts will inevitably be controlled by others. The individual who is at the mercy of every passing emotion, every moment of anxiety, every surge of anger or fear cannot maintain the steady concentration that sustained achievement requires. But the person who learns to observe his own mind with the same objectivity that a scientist observes experimental data develops a kind of immunity to psychological manipulation and emotional turbulence. He recognizes thoughts and feelings as phenomena to be studied rather than commands to be obeyed. He understands that his identity is not equivalent to whatever happens to be passing through his consciousness at any given moment. This understanding creates a profound shift in how one relates to challenge and adversity. The man whose sense of self depends on external validation will be devastated by criticism and paralyzed by uncertainty. His focus will scatter in every direction as he attempts to manage impressions and control outcomes that lie beyond his actual influence. But the man who has learned to maintain his center regardless of external circumstances can direct his attention steadily toward what he can actually control and influence. David discovered this during his third year of practice when his company faced a major crisis that threatened its survival. Market conditions had shifted dramatically, several key clients had terminated their relationships, and rumors of bankruptcy were circulating throughout the industry. Many of his colleagues responded with panic, working frantically on damage control efforts that often contradicted each other, spreading gossip and speculation that only increased the general atmosphere of chaos and fear. But David had learned to recognize crisis as opportunity in disguise. While others scattered their energy across multiple fronts of worry and speculation, he focused entirely on identifying the specific actions he could take to add value during the turbulent period. He analyzed which clients were most likely to remain loyal and concentrated his efforts on strengthening those relationships. He identified which business lines were most profitable and developed plans to expand them even as other areas contracted. Most importantly, David maintained the discipline of his focus practices even as the pressure mounted. He continued to protect his morning hours for strategic thinking. He continued to limit his exposure to speculation and gossip. He continued to base his decisions on careful analysis rather than emotional reaction. This consistency of practice during difficult times strengthened his mental discipline far more than any amount of practice during calm periods could have achieved. The result was that while many of his colleagues became less effective as stress increased, David became more valuable to the organization precisely when such value was most needed. His calm presence and clear thinking became resources that others relied upon. His ability to see opportunities within apparent disasters made him indispensable to the leadership team that was navigating the crisis. When the company eventually emerged from its difficulties stronger than before, David's role in this transformation was undeniable. But more importantly for his own development, he had proven to himself that his focus practices were not just productivity techniques, but genuine sources of strength that remained reliable under the most challenging circumstances. This experience taught him that true focus is not the ability to concentrate when conditions are ideal, but the capacity to maintain mental discipline when everything is falling apart around you. It is easy to be focused when you feel motivated and energized. The real test comes when you are tired, stressed, overwhelmed, and surrounded by chaos. The man who can maintain his center during such times possesses a form of power that no external force can threaten or remove. The deeper David explored the principles of focused attention, the more he began to understand why these practices had been central to every genuine tradition of human development throughout history. The monks who spent years in contemplative practice were not escaping from the world, but developing the mental strength necessary to engage with it effectively. The warriors who trained their minds as rigorously as their bodies understood that victory in battle depends more on clarity of thought than superiority of weapons. The great artists, scientists, and leaders who shaped human civilization all shared this common characteristic. They had learned to concentrate their mental energy so completely on their chosen domains that they could perceive possibilities and solutions that remained invisible to more scattered minds. Mozart could compose entire symphonies in his head because his focus on music was so complete that he could manipulate complex musical structures as easily as most people manipulate simple sentences. Newton could discover the laws of physics because his concentration on natural phenomena was so intense that he could detect patterns that had escaped human notice for millennia. These examples illustrate a crucial point about the relationship between focus and capability. Focused attention does not just improve performance within existing abilities, it actually expands the boundaries of what becomes possible. The mind that learns to concentrate deeply begins to operate at levels of effectiveness that seem almost supernatural to those who have never experienced such states of consciousness. David witnessed this phenomenon in his own development as his practice deepened. Problems that had once seemed impossibly complex began to resolve themselves almost automatically when he brought sufficient focused attention to bear upon them. Solutions would appear in his mind fully formed, as if they had been waiting for him to become quiet enough to perceive them. Insights about business strategy, relationship dynamics, and personal development would arise spontaneously during periods of concentrated thought. This was not mystical or supernatural, but reflected the natural operation of a mind that had learned to function at its optimal level. Just as physical training allows the body to perform feats that seem impossible to the untrained, mental training allows consciousness itself to operate with a precision and power that appears miraculous to those who have never developed these capabilities. The transformation from scattered to focused attention is therefore not just a change in technique, but a fundamental evolution in the quality of consciousness itself. The focused man does not just accomplish more tasks, he becomes a different kind of person entirely. His perceptions become sharper, his judgments more reliable, his presence more commanding. Others sense this difference, even when they cannot articulate what they are detecting. This shift in presence becomes particularly important in leadership situations. The executive who cannot control his own attention will inevitably create confusion and anxiety in others. His scattered energy will spread throughout the organization like a virus, undermining the concentration and effectiveness of everyone under his influence. Teams led by such individuals typically exhibit the same fragmented, reactive patterns that characterize their leader's mental state. But the leader who has mastered his own focus creates an entirely different organizational dynamic. His clarity becomes contagious, his calmness stabilizes others during turbulent periods, and his ability to distinguish between what matters and what doesn't helps everyone else make better decisions about how to invest their own energy and attention. David experienced this firsthand as he began to take on greater leadership responsibilities within his organization. Teams that had previously struggled with competing priorities and conflicting directives began to function more smoothly when he provided clear, focused guidance. Projects that had been stalled by indecision and overcomplexity moved forward rapidly when he helped establish clear objectives and eliminate unnecessary complications. Most surprisingly, he discovered that his focused approach to leadership actually required less effort than his previous style of constant intervention and micromanagement. By concentrating on the few decisions that truly mattered and trusting his team to handle everything else, he achieved better results with significantly less stress and energy expenditure. This paradox, that focused effort produces greater results with less total energy, reflects a fundamental principle of efficiency that applies across all domains of human activity. The scattered approach appears to be working harder because it involves more visible activity, but most of this activity is wasted motion that produces heat rather than light, noise rather than signal. The focused approach may appear effortless precisely because it eliminates all the unnecessary friction that scattered attention creates. Like a master craftsman who makes difficult work look easy through the elimination of wasted motion, the person with developed focus accomplishes more by doing less, but doing that less with complete presence and precision. Understanding this principle allowed David to recognize that much of what passes for hard work in modern culture is actually a form of sophisticated procrastination. The person who works 12-hour days but accomplishes little of lasting value is avoiding the more challenging task of determining what truly deserves attention and then giving that thing their complete focus. True productivity requires the courage to be unproductive in areas that don't matter. It demands the wisdom to disappoint people whose requests are not aligned with your highest priorities. It necessitates the strength to remain unmoved by urgency that does not serve importance. Most difficult of all, It requires the honesty to acknowledge when busy activity is being used as a substitute for the deep thinking and creative engagement that meaningful work actually demands. As David's understanding of these principles deepened, he began to see that the battle for focus was ultimately a battle for freedom itself. The person whose attention is controlled by others is enslaved regardless of his apparent status or position. The individual who has learned to direct his own consciousness according to his chosen values and objectives possesses a form of liberty that no external authority can threaten or remove. This recognition led to what David would later consider the most important insight of his entire transformation: that the goal of developing focus is not to become more efficient at serving others' agendas, but to become capable of pursuing one's own deepest purposes with unwavering dedication and increasing effectiveness. The weak man who destroys himself does so not through dramatic acts of self-destruction, but through the gradual erosion of his capacity for sustained attention to what matters most. He allows his days to be consumed by the urgent at the expense of the important, his hours to be fragmented by interruption and distraction, his energy to be dissipated across a dozen competing priorities that prevent him from making meaningful progress on any single objective. Such a man is destroyed not by external enemies, but by his own unconscious cooperation with forces that seek to harvest his attention for their benefit rather than his own. He becomes a resource to be extracted rather than a force to be reckoned with. His life becomes something that happens to him rather than something he deliberately creates. But the man who recognizes his focus as his source of power and protects it accordingly cannot be destroyed by others, because he has eliminated the internal weakness that external destruction requires. He has become unconquerable not through the development of defensive capabilities, but through the elimination of the vulnerabilities that conquest depends upon. This transformation from weakness to strength, from scattered to focused, from reactive to proactive, represents the fundamental challenge and opportunity that faces every person who wishes to live with power and purpose rather than drift through life as a victim of circumstances and the agendas of others. The path is neither easy nor quick, but it is available to anyone willing to undertake the disciplined practice of attention training that great individuals throughout history have recognized as the foundation of all other achievements. The techniques are simple, but their application requires the kind of sustained commitment that most people are unwilling to make. Yet for those who do make this commitment, who choose to treat their focus as their most precious possession and guard it accordingly, the rewards extend far beyond mere productivity or success. They discover a quality of consciousness, a depth of presence, and an effectiveness of action that transforms not only what they accomplish, but who they become in the process of accomplishing it. The man who destroys his weak self through the development of unwavering focus does not become invulnerable to external challenge. He becomes something far more powerful. He becomes irrelevant to such challenges because he operates according to principles and purposes that transcend the petty manipulations and power games that consume those who have not learned to master their own minds. In an age of infinite distraction and constant pressure to fragment our attention across multiple competing demands, the ability to maintain sustained focus on what truly matters is not just an advantage. It is the defining characteristic that separates those who shape reality from those who are shaped by it. The choice belongs to each individual to remain scattered and weak, or to become focused and therefore unconquerable. This is the deepest wisdom that Machiavelli understood, and that every person seeking genuine power must learn: that all external strength begins with internal discipline. All influence over others requires first mastering oneself, and all lasting achievement depends upon the development of an attention so concentrated and protected that it becomes an irresistible force capable of transforming any obstacle into an opportunity. Your focus is indeed your power, protected at all costs. For in doing so, you protect not just your effectiveness but your very sovereignty as a conscious being in a world that seeks constantly to make you unconscious. The man who wins this inner battle has already won every outer battle that truly matters. Everything else becomes merely a matter of time and technique.